Okay, it's time to get started. This is David Krause, your friendly Chief Medical Officer. We're very honored and proud to have Dr. Ruth Benca join us today to talk about sleep rhythms and genetics in psychiatry. Dr. Benca is the chairperson of Psychiatry and Human Behavior at the University of California, Irvine, and she did her undergraduate degree at Harvard. She also obtained a MD and PhD from the University of Chicago. And I will just say that Dr. Benca has a long curriculum vitae. She's been interested in sleep for many years, and she's particularly interested in the relationship between sleep, Alzheimer's disease, mood disorders, and depression, an area which is of extreme interest to Genomind and to our customers and patients. Dr. Benca told me that when she's at a cocktail party and she wants to be engaged, she tells people she's a sleep specialist. When she wants to be alone, she tells people she's a psychiatrist. So,
but I don't go to that many cocktail parties.
Ruth, it's a pleasure to have you. We're honored to have you as a member of our SAB. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I'll just, since it's a little bit strange giving a lecture without seeing anybody, I'll just kind of go through this and we'll have some time for questions or discussions at the end. And so again, to start out, I think the whole field of genetics related to sleep and rhythms in psychiatry is still kind of in its infancy, but there's some really interesting things going on, and I think some of the genetic work that's coming out is starting to tie some of the relationships that we've been seeing for many decades amongst sleep rhythms and psychiatric disorders together. So let's see if I can figure out how to do this. All right. So to start, I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about sleep and sleep disorders and psychiatry just to get us all on the same page. But I think one of the interesting things for everybody to be aware of is that although sleep medicine is a relatively new field, it is a rapidly growing field because sleep disorders and sleep deprivation rates are increasing rather dramatically. We're now at the point where probably about a third of the country is sleep deprived based on getting less than 7 hours of sleep per day on average, which epidemiologically we know is associated with poorer health outcomes. About 1 in 5 people in the United States suffers from a significant sleep disorder, and at the present time there are over 70 different sleep disorders that have been identified in 6 different categories, which I'm not going to go through, but just to sort of keep that as a background, that sleep disorders are very common. In terms of psychiatry, one of the things that I want to go over today a bit is how sleep and rhythm disturbances are very prevalent in psychiatric patients and also increase risk for new onset and recurrence of psychiatric disorders. One thing I'm not going to talk about today, just because of lack of time, is that there's also some evidence that treating sleep disorders, rhythm disorders, and just sleep problems in general in psychiatric patients may help improve outcomes in these disorders. Although, again, we need a lot more data in that area. All right, so let's just kind of go over a little bit about what sleep is, just to remind everybody, because again, some of the genetic work is, starting to look at some of the important sleep rhythms and sleep architecture. So we divide sleep up into sort of 2 general flavors, which is non-rapid eye movement or non-REM sleep, which is about 75 to 80% of the night, and then rapid eye movement or REM sleep, which is sometimes called dreaming sleep because dreaming is more common in REM sleep, although you can dream in any stage of sleep. And that's about 20 to 25% of our sleep at night. As we look through this table, can you see my arrow moving? No? Yes?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So So we have the different stages of sleep here, and so basically this is relaxed wakefulness with an alpha rhythm. As we start to fall asleep, we go into a transitional state, stage 1, which is sort of a drowsy state where there may be some dreamlike mentation and people generally still feel that they're kind of awake, but they're drifting off to sleep. And then non-REM sleep is subdivided into stage non-REM 2, which is characterized by sleep spindles and these large K complexes, which are basically slow waves. And as the slow waves get more prominent and the spindles start to decrease, we get into deep non-REM sleep or slow wave sleep or delta sleep with these big high amplitude, low frequency slow waves. Now spindles, these 12 to 14 hertz bursts of activity, and slow waves are characteristic of sleep. They do not occur in wakefulness, and they appear to be very important for some of the processes that occur in sleep, including learning and memory. So sleep spindles and slow waves, there are also genetic components of them that are starting to be examined, and as we'll see, they are relevant for psychiatric disorders. They also have their own topography, and this is using a high-resolution EEG cap, so 256 channels. We can map out power in these different frequency bands, and spindles tend to be most prominent over the vertex because they are originating from the reticular nucleus of the thalamus. Slow waves are most prominent in prefrontal regions and are related to brain plasticity. All right, there are two major forces that govern our sleep pattern across the day and night, and one of them is the homeostatic drive to sleep, sometimes called process S, and that simply is the fact that the longer that we're awake, the more strongly we would like to sleep, and the homeostatic process theoretically could impact our sleep behavior at any time of the day or night. So if we're sleep deprived, we're going to be sleepy. As we sleep across the night, we dissipate that drive. The other process is the circadian rhythm that in terms of sleep wakefulness, we believe is mostly functioning by creating an alerting signal, which is actually most prominent in the evening. I think a lot of people think their circadian rhythm wakes them up in the morning and puts them to sleep at night, and it's kind of the opposite. So we wake up in the morning with a relatively low circadian drive to be awake, and we wake up in the morning because we're not sleep deprived anymore. And as the day goes on and we get more sleep deprived, we stay awake because our circadian alerting signal is waking us up. And we might have a little siesta time in the afternoon as our wakefulness drive has increased, but our circadian alerting drive isn't sufficient to keep us awake, and we may take a nap and then we wake up. And then the opposite happens across the night. We go to sleep at the beginning of the night because we're sleep deprived. We stay asleep towards the end of the night here because our circadian alerting signal basically bottoms out and is gone. And then melatonin here is basically the hormone of darkness that helps keep us entrained and kind of reinforces to our brain that it should do what it's supposed to do at night. There are also other factors that govern our sleep behavior, and one of them that's important to keep in mind is seasonality. Human beings are also seasonal creatures. We're a little less seasonal than we used to be because of the advent of indoor electric lighting and outdoor electric lighting, or outdoor lighting as well. And this just shows that across the years, in the summer time, we tend to sleep less. We wake up earlier, and our overall sleep duration goes down. And then in the winter, when the nights are longer, we tend to sleep longer. And it mostly has to do with changes in our waking time, a little bit more so than our going to bed time. And there is, of course, individual variability in terms of how seasonal people are. The most important factor that governs our sleep behavior is really our age, however. Sleep is critically important for brain development, so the biggest changes in sleep occur between birth and the middle of the third decade of life, when the brain is finally finished maturing. And I don't have the youngest age here, but even by age 5 here, young children are sleeping more than 10 hours a night. And then when they hit puberty, there's a big drop in sleep amount. And then as we age, we tend to sleep less and less. Although our sleep becomes more fragmented, we lose our deep non-REM slow wave sleep. Particularly with pathologic aging, we may lose some of our REM sleep, and as we age, we may even spend more time in bed to get less sleep. We don't know for sure whether older people need less sleep or they're simply less able to sleep, and it's probably a little bit of both. And in addition, there are, of course, significantly increased rates of sleep disorders and other medical and psychiatric disorders that are prevalent in older adults that also contribute to difficulties with sleep. I also want to point out that there are significant sex-related differences in sleep patterns that particularly start in adolescence. Women actually get a bit more sleep than men. They have more slow wave sleep, and they have more spindle activity than men. And this is not just an artifact of brain size or skull thickness. In general, women are a little bit more morning types, and men tend to be more evening or night owl types. And this, again, starts to emerge in adolescence, although all adolescents are more night owls than older adults. And women in general will go to bed earlier and wake up earlier. They also have significantly higher rates of insomnia. And one of, I think, the interesting questions in psychiatry is whether any of these sex-related sleep differences impact their risk for psychiatric disorders. And we're going to hear more about that in a minute, but just to kind of keep this in mind. And so one of the I think, strong associations is that women, of course, have much more insomnia. They also have a much higher risk for depression, and one of the questions is whether their increased risk for insomnia seems to be associated with the increased risk for depression, and probably that's the case. The other interesting thing, and one of the areas I'm kind of interested in, is insomnia is more specifically linked with risk for Alzheimer's disease than with other forms of dementia. And women are at increased risk for getting Alzheimer's disease, and not just because they live longer. And so one of the questions is, are they at greater risk for Alzheimer's disease because of their greater risk for insomnia? And then on the other hand, as I mentioned, women have more spindle activity, and they also have a different general pattern of development of Alzheimer's disease. They tend to develop it at a later age, and I'm going to talk a little bit about spindles and schizophrenia shortly, but again, one of the questions is the different sex-related differences in spindle activity provide any degree of protection for women with schizophrenia. All right, so let's talk now a little bit about sleep abnormalities in patients with depression, and this was one of the first studies that I did now a number of years ago in the sleep psychiatry field, and this was a meta-analysis that I did with Chris Gillen, who was one of my mentors, and it's actually one of the first large meta-analyses that was done in psychiatry, where we looked at 171 studies of over 7,000 subjects, including patients with psychiatric disorders as well as normal control subjects. And basically, in acutely, there are decrements in total sleep time, which is there tend to be decreases in sleep efficiency, meaning that less time is spent sleeping of the time that people spend in bed at night. It takes most psychiatric patients longer to fall asleep. And then in patients with mood disorders, There are some other changes that were noted in general, one of which is thought to be a potential biomarker for mood disorders, which is reduced REM sleep latency, meaning that these patients enter REM sleep earlier than average, generally less than 60 minutes for their first non-REM cycle. Now, there have been a couple of other meta-analyses done since then, one a few years back, which once again found that REM sleep abnormalities, particularly reduced REM latency and probably increased volume of REM sleep, were most affected in major depression. But one of the problems with looking at sleep macroarchitecture is that it's, first of all, variable night to night, and it doesn't really distinguish patients with depression from other groups of psychiatric disorders. And one of, I think, the interesting features is that the short REM latency does seem to be a heritable biomarker in that first-degree relatives of people with depression and short REM latency are more likely to have that as well. And it is probably predictive in both major depression and bipolar disorder, but we really don't know what the genetic basis is for it, although it could involve a large number of different kinds of genes, and we'll see more about these later because some of these genes do seem to be related to psychiatric risk and sleep abnormalities related to psychiatric risk. So insomnia is not only present in patients who are acutely ill with psychiatric disorders, but is predictive, in particular, of new onset of depression. And there have been quite a number of studies looking at this epidemiologically. This is a meta-analysis that was done a few years ago, which basically shows that people who have chronic insomnia are about 2.5 times as likely to develop depression in the next year or so compared to people without insomnia. There are also studies that have shown that insomnia is predictive of development of other psychiatric disorders, again with follow-ups of at least a year or so. So in particular, again, depression, but also anxiety, alcohol abuse, and psychosis. This is a study that we did that actually looked a little bit more objectively at sleep. So one of the problems with insomnia is that it's a self-report, and patients are not always that accurate about how much they sleep or the quality of their sleep, and it's often hard to map on insomnia symptoms to objective changes in sleep. So this was an epidemiologic study, the Wisconsin Sleep Cohort Study, and we looked at subjects, these are again people in the general population, subjects who were in the top versus the bottom quartile of poor sleepers or good sleepers based on how long it took them to fall asleep, how much time they spent awake after they were asleep, their sleep efficiency, or their total sleep time. And they're subjects that would come into the sleep lab every 4 years to have their sleep measured. And what we found is that for people who did not have depression when they had their sleep lab study, who were then followed for up to 4 years, those in the poor sleeping category in every case were significantly more likely to develop new onset of depression than those who were in the top quartile in terms of their sleep. So both objective and subjective sleep disturbance is associated with risk for new onset of depression. Insomnia also is very common in schizophrenia, and actually psychotic patients have the most disrupted sleep, and it also seems to precede new onset or worsening of psychosis, and is also predictive of suicidal behavior in schizophrenia. And we'll also see in a little bit the relationship between sleep problems and suicide in people in general and other types of patients. I want to spend a moment here, though, focusing on sleep spindles and schizophrenia, because this is probably the most sensitive and specific biomarker we have for schizophrenia, although it is not currently something that is used clinically. It is the focus of a lot of research studies, and this is work that was originally done by Fabio Ferrarelli, who's at University of Pittsburgh. And what he showed was, again, using high-resolution EEG, that individuals with schizophrenia have a deficit in their sleep spindles. And again, these are driven by the reticular thalamic nucleus, and the finding has now been confirmed not only in people with known diagnoses of schizophrenia, but in early onset. It also tends to be seen in first-degree relatives of individuals with schizophrenia, so is probably a heritable biomarker, and we also know that spindle activity is genetically determined. There's a study from Harvard, Dara Manoj and colleagues have shown or have suggested that the CACNA1 gene may be important here because it has been associated with schizophrenia, and it also seems to be involved in sleep spindle activity in the thalamic reticular nucleus. So probably more to come there, but this is probably an opportunity for looking at schizophrenia risk or maybe diagnosis, both genetically as well as electrophysiologically. All right, so now we'll talk about insomnia and suicide, which has also been an interest of mine. We know from many epidemiologic studies that insomnia is strongly predictive of suicidal ideations, behaviors, and suicide deaths. And this is across the age span. It's been shown in adolescents through the elderly. And so in addition to insomnia being predictive of suicide, short sleep duration, depending on the study, either less than 4 hours a night, which is really short sleep duration, or even just less than 8 hours a night, is associated with increased suicidal behaviors, even after adjusting for psychiatric disorders. So it's not just that the person happens to be psychiatrically ill and, of course, has sleep disturbance, but controlling for that. Wanted to spend a moment talking about excessive sleepiness, though, because it's not just self-reports of insomnia, but also self-reports of excessive sleepiness or hypersomnia or fatigue are, of course, associated with risk for psychiatric disorders. And probably this is from the Ford and Camero study here on the left, where they showed that in the general population, 40% of individuals with insomnia who reported insomnia had psychiatric disorders, but 46.5% of those with hypersomnia report psychiatric disorders. So excessive sleepiness or fatigue is just as much of a risk factor. And again, doesn't necessarily resolve, and may be more seen in bipolar disorder and atypical depression. The problem is that when we try to assess this in a sleep laboratory setting, doing multiple sleep latency tests, which is a NAP test to see how quickly people can fall asleep, patients with psychiatric illness who complain of excessive sleepiness are not all that sleepy compared to patients with central nervous system hypersomnias like narcolepsy or idiopathic hypersomnia, or even Klein-Levin syndrome, which is an episodic hypersomnia. They don't really seem to have prolonged sleep duration or sleep latencies that are all that reduced. So only about a quarter of them are in the what we call excessively sleepy range of having sleep latencies of 8 minutes or less. Okay, now focus a little bit on biological rhythms in psychiatric disorders. So not only is sleep disturbance highly associated, but also biological or circadian rhythm disturbances. And I think one of the problems in the sleep field in general is that we don't always look at these things together. do the people with insomnia also have rhythm problems and vice versa? Because, of course, the complaint of insomnia is common in people whose sleep timing systems are off. If you are very delayed in your sleep pattern, you're an extreme night owl, you are going to report insomnia if you try to go to bed at a normal time. And we know that patients with psychiatric disorders, I'll start with the second bullet first, particularly mood disorder, bipolar disorder, even more so than depression, schizophrenia, and post-traumatic stress disorder have all been associated with more eveningness, so people who tend to go to bed later and wake up later. These patients also have stronger seasonality patterns and also disrupted rhythms, sometimes almost being arrhythmic. And then to go along with that, in most of these disorders and in most psychiatric disorders have been associated with altered clock genes. Biorhythm abnormalities are also strongly associated with suicide, and in two ways. First of all, suicide attempts and suicidal behaviors occur rhythmically. They have a diurnal rhythm or a circadian rhythm in that they tend to occur more commonly in the evening, and they have a seasonal rhythm with a peak occurrence in the spring. In addition, people who tend to engage in suicidal behaviors show a stronger evening chronotype, and they tend to be more seasonal. And that's true both in depressed and non-depressed individuals. This is some data from Norwegian study that just looked in the general population, where they compared individuals with different degrees of self-reported seasonality. And what they found was that both in men and women, individuals who reported themselves as being more seasonal, which are the black bars, had higher levels of anxiety symptoms and higher levels of depressive symptoms. Looking within groups of patients with mood disorders compared to controls, what we see is that bipolar disorder is the most seasonal of all, and so the seasonal bipolars have the strongest expression of seasonality of their depressive symptoms, and the non-seasonal bipolars look like seasonal depressive patients. So mood disorders tend to have a very strong seasonal component. Just to kind of diverge for a moment, seasonality, of course, is an adaptive trait, particularly given that most humans and most of the land mass of the world is sort of a lot of it is above the equator, and as I mentioned earlier, humans do have seasonal patterns of behavior. We did some work looking at migratory sparrows a few years back and found a lot of similarities between migratory behavior and seasonality in bipolar disorder and bipolar behavior in general during mania. So mania tends to occur in the spring and a lesser peak in the fall. Migration occurs in the spring and the fall. And the behavioral changes are similar. There are changes in sleep amounts and circadian rhythms that are similar. And we found even back then that some of the genes that are overexpressed during migratory behavior are also seem to be related to bipolar disorder. I just want to mention also some other work that we've just finished that's coming out soon, looking at sleep and mood and suicidal ideation. We studied sleep and activity patterns in patients with depression, insomnia, and suicidal ideation, and looked at them over the course of treatment with antidepressants plus or minus a sleeping medication. And what we found was that there were associations between insomnia scores, so the more insomnia, the more suicidal the patients were. And we also found that those with more delayed sleep timing were more suicidal, both at the beginning of treatment and across treatment, even after we controlled for the degree of depression. So these were independent associations between insomnia and delayed sleep timing with suicidality. And we also found that as those parameters improved, they were independently associated with decreased suicidal ideation, independently of depression scores as well. So again, strong links between insomnia and so sleep complaints and rhythm complaints and suicidality. So to summarize, patients with psychiatric disorders have high rates of sleep complaints and sleep disorders, and that sleep disturbances are predictive of new onset or recurrence of psychiatric illness as well as suicidal behavior. Want to quickly run through, though, also the fact that there is a lot of comorbidity between sleep disorders and primary sleep disorders, which is, I think, an area that's largely neglected in psychiatric practice. And again, I'm going to just go through these quickly so we can get to a little bit of the genetic data. So if we look at patients with obstructive sleep apnea, which is one of the more common sleep disorders, about a third of patients with obstructive sleep apnea have depressive symptoms. About a third of them also have anxiety symptoms. And conversely, if we look at patients with major mental illness, whether it's mood disorders, bipolar disorders, or schizophrenia, there are high rates of obstructive sleep apnea in those patient populations. So it sort of goes both ways. Apnea patients have high rates of psychiatric symptoms. Psychiatric patients have high rates of sleep apnea. And this is a study that was in clinical populations. If we just look at population-based studies, there continues to be a significant comorbidity of sleep apnea in patients with psychiatric illness, again, with the highest rate in depression. And there are some suggestions that some of the structural changes from MRI studies in mood disorder patients overlap with some of the structural changes seen in apnea patients. Apnea is also very prevalent in PTSD. Over half of PTSD patients seem to have obstructive sleep apnea, although the caveat here is these are mostly veterans that have been studied, and so they have other elevated risk factors for apnea. Another interesting comorbidity, again, to keep in the back of our mind when we start looking at some of the genetic data, is that people with severe mental illness, of course, have increased cardiovascular disease. And that includes the prevalence of cardiovascular disease, incidence of new onset, and risk for cardiovascular disease-related deaths. And again, this is, in part related to other comorbidities, including things like sleep apnea and obesity and lack of medical care, but there may be some other genetic factors as well, as we'll see. In our own experience, when we did the study I just told you, and we were trying to eliminate people who looked like they might have apnea, as we screened people, we nevertheless found that about almost 15% of our subjects ended up having significant obstructive sleep apnea. All right, there are other sleep disorders that are common in psychiatric patients, one of which is restless legs. And this is a very interesting comorbidity, again, because of combined genetic risk that we'll see. And then, of course, circadian rhythm disorders, advanced sleep phase, but more commonly delayed sleep phase, or non-24 patients who really don't seem to have a strong rhythm of any type are seen in particularly patients with mood disorders and schizophrenia. All right, so summary, sleep disorders are common in psychiatric patients and vice versa. And one of the, I think, key questions is some of this comorbidity related to common genetic factors. I'm now going to go through some of the recent work that's been done looking at genetics of insomnia and other sleep-related problems. And this is a GWAS study that came out a couple of years ago, and there's a few that I'm going to show you now, that basically show that insomnia risk genes overlap with risk genes for a number of psychiatric and metabolic traits. And this is a little bit hard to read, but the top of the list are anxiety disorders, depressive symptoms, neuroticisms, major depressive disorder, cigarette smoking, type 2 diabetes, coronary artery disease, waist circumference, waist to hip ratio, body mass index. So these are the stronger correlations in terms of genetic overlap. Another study that came out a little earlier this year, Nature Genetics, found some similar relationships. So particularly insomnia was associated, again, with depression, anxiety, ADHD, neuroticism, restless legs, cigarette smoking, asthma, waist-hip ratio, type 2 diabetes, and coronary artery disease. These were the positive associations. Here is yet another one that just came out recently. Again, seeing that frequent insomnia symptoms are highly associated with adiposity, coronary artery disease, interestingly, number of children, neuroticism again, smoking, depression, and negative correlations with sleep duration, cognition, longevity. So the summary so far on insomnia genetics is that while GWAS studies have come up with groups of associations, the strongest associations is with the MICE1 gene, which we're going to see in a moment is also strongly related with restless legs. There is significant genetic overlap with other behavioral and disease traits, and some of the studies have suggested a possible causal link between, on a genetic basis, between insomnia and coronary artery disease, diminished well-being, and depression. And finally, there are sex-related differences in these GWAS associations, again, hearkening back to the fact that there are sex-related differences in sleep and risk for sleep disorders. Now turn a little bit to the biorhythms. And again, as I mentioned earlier, altered clock genes have been reported in many major psychiatric disorders. And again, these disorders are associated with greater eveningness and seasonality and more disrupted rhythms. I'm not going to go through the molecular clock mechanism. The Nobel Prize was awarded for the work that was done to figure out this transcription translation feedback loop that really governs the timing system, but most of the key genes are listed here, and pretty much all of them have been associated not only with abnormalities in circadian rhythms, but also with psychiatric disorders. In particular, the PER clock and cryptochrome variant genes are associated with chronotype, with homeostatic response to sleep loss in normals, and also appear to be associated with onset and course of mood disorders. A recent study suggests that a BDNF gene carriers with a MET alleles substitution were more vulnerable to sleep deprivation-related cognitive impairment. And we know that there are people have differential ability to withstand sleep deprivation and function cognitively. The work on the genetics of sleep patterns is still pretty early. This is, again, a very recent study, a GWAS study that suggested there were a number of genetics associations with different traits describing sleep quality, quantity, and timing. I think one caveat a lot of these studies is that while we, are very good at being very precise about the genetic work, the sleep data that is used is probably a lot less precise. A lot of it is self-report, which it can be notoriously inaccurate, particularly in people who have sleep problems, or at best with actigraphy, and we're only starting to be able to do genetic work with looking at a sleep EEG or more objective sleep markers. Again, here's a GWAS study that has been associated with chronotype, which is probably a little bit more accurate, again, because some of this data came from actigraphy or accelerometers, so that kind of shows when people are active or not active. And again, not surprisingly, many of the genes that are part of the circadian molecular clock are involved in determining chronotype. And I'm finishing up here with a review that was listing the SNPs of different circadian genes that have been associated with mood disorders, including bipolar disorder, major depression, and seasonal affective disorder. So again, many genes that have come up, again, mostly genes that are associated with or are part of the circadian clock. And finally, just to kind of keep in mind that I think some of the strongest data we have about sleep and genetics is with a few genes that have been strongly associated with sleep disorders. And the first is the MICE1 gene that has the strongest association with restless legs as well as with insomnia. Also, for narcolepsy, the HLA-DQB10602, class 2 HLA protein, and not only are virtually all patients with type 1 narcolepsy, which is narcolepsy with cataplexy, positive for this gene across pretty much all racial and ethnic groups, but also there's some suggestion that this gene may be associated with factors in non-narcoleptics, and about 25% of the population carries this gene. And it's also associated with multiple sclerosis. And I'm going to stop at this point so that we have a little time for questions or discussion. Thank you.
Wow, that was tremendous, Ruth. Thank you so much. Really fascinating stuff and a lot to digest.
Yeah.
I don't think it's surprising that if you asked a layperson, do you think that patients with psychiatric illness are more likely to have sleep disorders? And it seems intuitively obvious that that would be true. But it begs the question that you sort of touched on a little bit in the beginning, sort of the big picture, which is why do we sleep? Why do we need sleep, and why is sleep required?
Would you like me to answer that?
I know it's a big question, but
well, I think no, that's very interesting because I think that's where I think it's going to be a lot of interesting genetic information. So, some of the things we know about the function of sleep, which information is that it seems to be very important for synaptic homeostasis. This is the Tononi and Chiarelli hypothesis, and I think we've got a lot of evidence now at a molecular level, on microscopy level, and
we're having a lot of background noise. So if anybody who's not talking, if you could mute your phone, that would be great. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. So that a lot of what happens during sleep is that we eliminate synapses. So about 80% of the activity is elimination of synapses, and about 20% is we're strengthening synapses. So that's synaptic housekeeping, and that process is critically important for learning and memory. And a lot of moving memories from short-term to long-term storage probably also occurs during sleep. And that's why we don't form any new memories during sleep. We're either, sleep is both for remembering and forgetting. Sleep is also important for kind of house cleaning. So we know that interstitial spaces sort of open up more during sleep, and CSF fluid washes through. So we clear out toxic substances like amyloid and probably tau as well. Plus, during sleep, we don't produce as much amyloid. So there is a very interesting associations between sleep patterns and risk for Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative disorders. So a lot of the functions, and there are many other functions of sleep probably as well. We used to think sleep was only for the brain, and now we're starting to see that physiology outside the central nervous system is also affected by sleep. And there are, in fact, changes in gene expression throughout the body that are related to the presence or absence of sleep and interact with sleep as well. But we're still trying to figure out all the functions of sleep. We spend a third of our lives doing it, and it kind of takes us out of commission to do much of anything else. So it's pretty darn important.
I wish I had talked to you before I did all those late night studying sessions during school.
Yeah.
Does the use of hypnotics restore normal sleep, and does that have long-term effects?
That's a very kind of hot topic right now. There are a number of epidemiologic studies that came out that suggested that the use of hypnotics increases the risk for Alzheimer's disease and dementia. There's a study that came out that suggested that may not be the case because, of course, I didn't get into that here. Insomnia is also highly predictive of dementia, and people with sleep disturbance show, even who are cognitively normal, show evidence of greater Alzheimer's pathology by PET scans and CSF studies. So what we don't know is whether when people are taking hypnotics for many years, if their insomnia is just a very early symptom of their dementia that's going to happen years later, or the drugs are actually affecting that. And studies that don't look at very proximal use of hypnotics have not found an association between earlier use of hypnotics and dementia. In terms of whether hypnotics take the place of sleep or what they're doing to improve sleep is also complicated. We know that GABA transmission is highest during non-REM sleep, and most hypnotics work on the GABA system. They tend to increase spindle activity and decrease slow wave activity. We're not sure how relevant that is. Some studies suggest that the increase in spindling may improve learning, but other studies don't necessarily find that that's the case. Again, it's a kind of a controversial area. There's some studies that suggest maybe trazodone, it's a study that just came out, maybe that helps cognitive function, but there's a lot more we need to learn about that. And there are studies now suggesting that drugs that work on the orexin system may be less cognitively impairing in people with Alzheimer's or MCI than the more traditional hypnotics. There's also now suggestions, they're quite interesting, that anticholinergic drugs, there are two big epidemiologic studies suggesting that anticholinergic drugs, not all of them, but some groups of anticholinergic drugs are associated with increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. We also know that Alzheimer's disease is associated with loss of REM sleep, and the anticholinergic drugs that tend to increase Alzheimer's risk are also those, again, this hasn't been reported out, but as I look at them, they are those that tend to suppress REM sleep. So one of the questions is, is suppression of REM sleep, which we know REM sleep is important for brain plasticity and learning, is that affecting cognitive function? So, yeah, it's an very interesting area right now.
Do all animals sleep?
All animals sleep, yes. All animals sleep. Anything with a neuron basically sleeps. So we know jellyfish sleep, and they have very few neurons. Very simple worms sleep. Everything with a central nervous system sleeps. Some people would argue that the circadian cycles even of things like single-celled algae are sort of precursors of sleep-like states. So this whole idea that we organize our physiology around the 24-hour light-dark cycle is intrinsic to all life forms.
Okay, well, in the 3 or 4 minutes that we have left, I'll open it up to see if anyone else has any questions. I could ask you questions all day, so it's really fascinating stuff to me, but I'll open it up to anybody who's listening.
I put everybody to sleep.
I don't think so. Well, here's one more question. So for the HLA gene that we discussed with respect to narcolepsy,
Yes.
why should a sort of self-recognition gene or a protein complex that's associated with self-recognition have anything to do with narcolepsy?
Because it's probably an autoimmune process. We know that most autoimmune diseases are associated with different HLA phenotypes, and so this one probably increases risk for autoimmune disease. So it's that same gene also increases risk for MS, which is an autoimmune disease.
Yeah.
So it triggers an attack probably on the orexin or hypocretin cells in the lateral hypothalamus.
Okay, well, I think we'll stop here. Absolutely fascinating stuff and very useful for us as we consider developing products. I think we have one chat comment.
Just saying thank you for the info on anticholinergic drug sleep. That is very interesting.
If anybody wants the references, I'm happy to send those.
I'll send you an email afterwards, Ruth. I think that'll be very helpful for us.
You can do that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your knowledge with us. Absolutely fascinating stuff. We appreciate it.
Seeing people in the fall.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.